Hi, welcome to Overview Hebrew Scriptures, Module 2. Well, okay, first thing, before I forget, sometimes the audio and the visual on my computer get out of sync. I am not technically savvy enough to be able to know how to fix that, so I apologize in advance if that happens. Hopefully they will stay together, but I know it can be a little difficult to watch something that's not lined up the way you expect it to be. So apologies in advance. All right. With that said, also, I am so sorry we are not going to be together today. I would have liked to have it be different, but it was unavoidable to miss. Therefore, the pre-recorded lecture. This week, we are tackling history and metaphor. We'll be looking at Marcus Borg, chapter 3, the handout on the documentary hypothesis, and then we'll talk a little bit about the what would have been the work that we'd have done together in the Collaborate session around looking at metaphorical meaning in the Genesis story. So Genesis chapter 1 was the assigned scripture. So let's get into it. Last week we talked about ways of seeing and reading the Bible. Okay, so being able to take a look at it and allow it to be taken seriously, but not literally. We continue with it this week in looking at what Borg refers to as the historical and metaphorical approach, which for us in Unity is actually good news. Once again, to hear these kinds of words coming from a traditional, a scholar in the more traditional Christian stream is very gratifying, and I'm certainly enjoy that. So let's get into it. The historical approach. So these are the two, shorthand definitions. So on the historical approach, it's what does this text mean in the ancient historical setting in which it was written? Okay, so pretty straightforward on the, historical side. And a metaphorical lens is a non-literal way of reading the Bible texts, okay? So a non-literal way of reading the Bible text. And one of the things that's very challenging for us in Unity, at least it seems to be when I teach this course, is teasing out between metaphysics and metaphor. And as I talked about on the metaphysical, and I'll come back to that as we continue through the material. So let's break it down a little bit on this historical approach. And again, I'm covering the salient points as I see them out of the chapter that you read already, chapter 3. So the historical approach, what it is a look at the source, the form, the redaction, its process of becoming part of the canon, as well as interdisciplinary criticism. And in this sense, criticism meaning discernment. Historical also means that con, as in with, so with the text, okay? So it's meaning in its history with the text. The historical approach matters, all right? It matters, one, because it's indispensable for genuinely hearing the Bible as a collection of documents from the past, okay? So there's a real validity about that. And I think this, when there's an unwillingness to embrace or allow that to be part of it, the Bible gets, reduced. It gets closed into something that is not as valuable, or enhancing and enriching as it could be. So it is indispensable to hear, for genuinely hearing the Bible as a collection of documents from the past. And also, the historical approach recognizes the Bible as an artifact. So an artifact is something that is made in the past or gives a testimony to something, and it is tangible, right? So, the writings are tangible. If you think about our modern times, a couple examples of artifacts would be the horse-drawn carriage. Very few people use it as a regular mode of transportation, but we know that at one point in time, it held a very significant place in history. And kind of dating myself a little bit, but I think most of you will remember back in the early days of home movie viewing, when that first started coming around, we had cassettes that we plugged into a player. There was beta and VHS. VHS became the predominant way, and beta is an artifact. It is something of the past, and actually, frankly, as today as we speak, pretty much so is VHS. But in that realm of home movie video, home movie viewing, what those were the two that came out, and beta is the artifact. We also have to recognize in this idea of the Bible being made in the past is to look at the time frames over which the writings were put together. So in the Hebrew Bible, it was between the years 1000 to 200 before the Common Era. Okay, so if we're in the Common Era now at year 2020, we're talking over 3,000 years ago when the Bible first began getting put into written form. Okay, it had an oral history that went much earlier than that, but its written form, we see it happening in around about that period of time. And then in the Christian scriptures, happened in the time frame between 50 and 100 or 150 Common Era. So again, still the past. The historical approach seriously considers the historical and the cultural distance between then and now. So again, incredibly important to understand the social, or the cultural distance between that period of time and now. And when this happens, the historical approach allows the text to come alive then in its ancient context, so we can stop trying to overlay our sensibility on it. All right, this is why coming into it from a historical perspective, which we get some of that with our metaphorical interpretation, or metaphysical interpretation, but the challenge is that we still try to go over the way the Bible is presented. So if we can remember its cultural context, then it can be an avenue for it becoming less displeasing to us, or less offensive perhaps. All right, which kind of comes back to the perceptions and misperceptions of life in God, that we were talking about last week. And also the historical approach, it matters because it frees the Bible to speak with its own voices. Okay. Now, there are certainly limitations to a purely historical approach, namely with the modern worldview, especially with its emphasis on factuality. There can be a skepticism, and that preoccupation with factuality can actually flatten the text, So it's like, well, if we can't prove it really happened with archaeological evidence, then there's no value in it, which is not true. This is, again, a limitation of a purely historical approach. That purely historical approach also with the scholarship that can be very technical and specialized, it can lead to this disillusionment, which it goes along with the preoccupation with factuality. So it's kind of a shredding of the Bible, which can be very unfortunate. And also, if one only allows it to be in the past, then it limits its scope to its ancient meaning and thereby imprisons it there as well. So those are the limitations of only being willing to see it from a historical context, which certainly people who say, well, I don't believe in God, and there's no evidence of God, for example, that would say if we can't prove the Bible, then it has no value, it has no meaning. So let's shift now into the metaphorical side of things. And this is where I want to talk a little bit more about metaphor and metaphysics. So metaphor and metaphysics are both non-literal methodologies. All right, this is the important piece to keep in mind, is metaphor and metaphysics are both non-literal. Okay, so just kind of sink that in. When we talk about metaphysical, we know that the definition of metaphysical is beyond the physical or beyond the material. It is what's incorporeal, supernatural, or transcendent. It privileges God as the cause. It's the quest for ultimate reality. But from a practical standpoint, to try to give an example of how to think of these, differentiate them, a metaphysical interpretation is, I'm going to say, we'll use it in a more first-person way. Like we're looking for, how does this character, how does this story, how do the symbols in this, how are they a reflection of my own consciousness? How are they a reflection of a way of being that is about who I am? Okay, as an individual, as a spiritual being. So it's more of a first-person approach. A metaphorical approach can be thought of more as a third person perspective. So in other words, we're using, there's language that's being used to convey the idea about something. So it is telling us about something. It is not standing inside of it and looking at it for its meaning from inside. But both, again, are non-literal. And we'll talk more about that as we continue on. So let's unpack the metaphorical approach some as it is laid out in the chapter. In a broad sense, as we said, we know that metaphor can be, it is intrinsically non-literal, and so one form of metaphor is one that affirms and negates, and the example given is, my love is a red, red rose. So the beloved is a rose, but it's obviously literally not a rose, okay? So it's affirming that it's a rose, but also we know, literally speaking, it's not. The other piece about with the metaphorical approach is that it has multiple nuances. Okay, so the Greek root of the word metaphor is to carry with. To carry with. So it carries or bears resemblance or associations of meaning, and it can't be reduced to necessarily a single meaning. Okay, so metaphor allows for really a broad way of engaging a writing. So the metaphorical approach also is to see something as. As Borg talks about, it's to see something as something else is one way, and that it's a verbal or linguistic art. So I see my beloved as a rose is another example. Last week in conversation, we talked about thunder clapping. Somebody said, that's an example of a metaphor. Thunder clapping, or the mountain shouting, our linguistic art, verbal art. Metaphor also emphasizes seeing rather than believing. Okay, so this is again something that it can be really helpful for us, because there's this emphasis on belief, it can take us away from the beauty of what the story is trying to convey. So metaphor and this language is intended to try to help us see something. So metaphors can be profoundly true, even if they are not literally true. And one of my favorite quotes out of the book is that metaphor is poetry plus, not factuality minus. Poetry plus, not factuality minus. It's not less than fact, but it's actually more than. So it expands on the facts. As with the historical approach, there are limitations to the metaphorical approach, and certainly one of those limitations is that one's imagination can run too freely and produce something that has little or nothing to do with the actual text. And so when we look at an interpretation, whether we're looking at it metaphor or metaphysical, it needs to bear some resemblance to the text that it came from. And through this, the metaphorical approach then has its controls of some conceivable connection to the text by recognizing A, its historical context, and B, the discernment of the community. This would be like the community of our peers, okay? So the discernment of the community would be this understanding of the Bible and its place in the Israelite or Hebrew/Christian story and its sense of fit. All right, so it's like, your peers being able to say, who are within that same tradition, especially, to be able to say, like, I don't know. I think that this is, you might want to take a look at it differently because it's too far afield. So bottom line is Borg is saying when we're sitting down to read the Bible, we need both. We need both history and metaphor, which allows the Bible to breathe. Oh my God. Right? I mean, speaking of breathing and, just taking a moment, it allows the Bible to do this, to breathe. And we don't have to, for those of us in Unity who are especially enamored of metaphysical interpretation, and certainly I am one of them as well, we can allow it to breathe and let it be without having to, as another way of being able to embrace the wisdom it has to offer us. So the Bible is a combination of history and metaphor. We have history that's remembered or historical memories of events, and then there are metaphorical narratives. The breakdown of those metaphorical narratives are an event happened, or maybe it happened and it's given a metaphorical meaning, or it's something that is purely metaphorical. So the litmus tests that let me talk about a narrative that metaphorizes history as an example. There is good reason to believe that there was a time in the history of the Israelites where they were making their way from Egypt to the land of Canaan. So the wandering in the wilderness is certainly an event that could have happened, all right? So they are wandering, we know it as the wandering in the wilderness. And God provides manna from heaven. All right, so there's a potential historical event that has the metaphor of God providing food. And the story is telling us about how it is that God does this by providing the bread or the manna that comes from heaven. So that's an example of a narrative that metaphorizes history. When we look at narratives that are purely metaphorical, Borg uses two factors as a litmus test for that. One, he says, does the story look as if it's reporting something, or are there signs suggesting that it is to be read symbolically? And the other litmus test for a purely metaphorical writing is, does the story push the limits? He uses the term spectacular rather than miracles, because miracles can happen for sure. So does the story push the limits of the spectacular? So are there things in the story that really don't seem to have ever happened anywhere? And again, we can hold that softly, because yes, there are miracles and there are phenomena that are inexplicable and so on. So again, we're not trying to be rigid about this. It's just a holding container. So some example of stories in the Hebrew scriptures that would fit into this category is the parting of the Red Sea, especially the way it's described. Okay, so it's spectacular. I just always get a vision of Moses, standing there and the seas parting, right, from the movie, from the Ten Commandments. So very epic in the way it's described. And another example of something metaphorical, purely metaphorical, is the idea of Moses again using the staff and striking a rock in order to produce water. Okay, so, it's like, have we ever seen that happen? No, not in that way, not in the way it's described. So some, potential examples to see as narratives that could be looked at as metaphorical. And certainly, as I said, the Psalms are often metaphors. Song of Solomon, beautiful. I mean, that's pure poetry. Okay, so we can really see that, and lots of metaphor in there in terms of seeing things as and comparative, using metaphor as a comparative rather than as symbols to tell a story. So to see history and metaphor both, the implication is that first off, we can recognize that the ancient communities metaphorized or mythologized their history. And it was part of making meaning. Joseph Campbell talks so much about the purpose and the role of myth and how essential myth is for us as human beings. And, kind of if we think about our own, family histories, there may be stories that get bigger as time goes on and, as a way of trying to convey something that was important in our family history. So the implication is to recognize that these ancient communities metaphorized or mythologized their history and that is part of how they made meaning. And the other part is in the modern worldview, we've tended to literalize their mythology. I think that's a profound statement, that the modern worldview has tended to literalize the mythology. And what Borg says is the latter, okay, the second of the two, of literalizing the mythology produces nonsense. So if you really try to literalize a story that is mythological, it's just like it goes beyond, sensibility, in a rational way. So we can end up with nonsense, whereas the former of letting the history be metaphorized, letting the history be mythologized, gives us a powerful story. And in that story, we are storytellers. We are meaning-making creatures, okay? And those stories can tell us things that are incredibly important. And certainly as it relates to the Bible, these are stories of the divine-human relationship. In the Hebrew Bible, they are the ancient Israelite stories about the relationship with God, okay? The ancient Israelite stories about the relationship with God. And in the Christian scriptures, these are the early Christian stories about the relationship in God as disclosed through Jesus of Nazareth. And in the Christian scriptures, we unpack that even more. But for our purpose, because we're focusing on the Hebrew scriptures, these are ancient Israel's stories about the relationship with God. As such, when we see them in this way, the historical, metaphorical approach, they become perennial stories, and there is wisdom that is applicable for us today, just as it was at the time the stories were written. But we are able to allow the historical to be that, and to use the metaphorical to bring forth the wisdom that can help us today. So this way of being with the Bible, Borg continues in chapter 3 of reading the Bible in what he refers to as a post-critical naivety. So, right, a naivety is an innocence. Okay, so if we're naive about something, there's an innocence there. And so, in a pre-critical state of innocence, there is just, we take things at face value. That's, from a psychological standpoint, this is our concrete, literal stage of development. So whatever the authority tells us is true, if our parents tell us or our teachers tell us that something is true, then it's heard as true. So an example of that for me, I remember in childhood, one of my aunts, my father's eldest sister, I remember wrote a letter to him, and it was apparently on the cusp of my dad's birthday, and she said something about, her birthday, and she said something about she was going to be 29 again. She was going to be 29. That was what she said. She was going to be 29, and my dad was laughing about, my Aunt B is going to be 29. When I shared the story at school, and I believed it, and when I shared the story at school, the teacher was like, in this case, the teacher was like, no, that can't possibly be, because your father is, in his 20s, and she was considerably older than him. But the point I'm going after is that my Aunt B said she's going to be 29, so of course she's 29, and my dad said that, laughingly, that she's going to be 29. So there's this, if you can think in your own life, about this concrete, literal stage of development that is an important stage of development we go through, is that we see things as true, especially when they are presented to us by an authoritative figure. So in the biblical context, it's a point in time where we believe that Moses did part the Red Sea. It's like, oh, wow. And that Mary was a virgin. Okay, that's believing that is part of that, because that's the way it's presented, so it must be true. Okay, we move into a phase of our psychological development where we get into the phase of what's called critical thinking, and that's a point where we start to question the stories that are told to us. I used the example of the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. We begin to wonder about the factuality, of those stories. It's an aspect of critical thinking, being able to ask questions for ourselves. So another example I remember is that there's a stage of development where you can take two containers with children. You can science experiment. You can take two containers of different size. You pour identical amount of water in each, but because the containers are different size, the water is distributed differently. There's a period of time where one will look at it, this is like that critic, and say, well, they are holding different amounts of water. And then there comes a place where the child can begin to see that, oh, it's actually the same amount of water, but it's placed differently. Okay, so again, part of that shift from pre-critical to a critical stage of seeing. And so critical thinking allows one to start to question something like, is it possible that the virgin birth story, the virgin conception, is a continuation of special birth stories that exist in the Hebrew Bible? So we do see special birth stories in the Hebrew Bible. But the post-critical naivete is a stage that Borg says, it's not a given. It is something that is acquired or sought. And generally speaking, people who find their way into a New Thought denomination or a very progressive, Christian denomination are people who are in this kind of ilk or moving toward this ilk of post-critical naivety, typically. And you have to ask yourself, where are you in the spectrum as it relates to the Bible? That's the part of the question in the discussion board. As it relates to the Bible, you may see yourself in post-critical naivete in other areas of your life, but kind of like what happens or has happened for you as you've moved through the way the Bible is you see the Bible. So he says that this stage is something that is not a given. And it's a way of hearing the birth story is true, for example, but not historically factual. Think about the creation stories. We can see them as not being 7 24-hour periods, but the truth of the story resides in its meaning and its metaphorical narratives, all right? So we get the truth from that standpoint, and the truth is not dependent on factuality. Okay, I'm going to wait till I get to the. I just had a thought, but I'm going to put a pin in that. This essentially encapsulates now the chapter from Borg. I want to move over to the handout for this week on the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis I see as actually being an example of a post-critical naivety. It is the result of biblical scholarship, so taking a stance that was willing to look at the apparent inconsistencies and ask why. How could this be possible? Because for hundreds of years, it was believed, for example, that Moses was the sole author of the Torah, and somebody's like, doesn't make sense. So the documentary hypothesis steps in as through scholarship and through an academic lens as well, is willing to engage those questions, and it then opens the Hebrew scriptures, as I see it, for a more nuanced reading. Okay, allows us to have a more nuanced reading while again retaining its significance. And it shows an evolution in the relationship with God as these different writers have come, as the different writers have come in. So this is one of the main points of the documentary hypothesis is the allowing for multiple authors, versus Moses, as I said before, being the sole author of the Torah. And it basically brings us down to the four main authors of the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly writer, and the Deuteronomistic writer. So J as Yahwist, and that's because J is the opening letter of Yahweh, Yahwist in German. It's spelled with a J, so J for the Yahwist. E for the Elohim, so God is referred to as Elohim, is where we see that. P being the priestly writer, and D for the Deuteronomistic writer. And then you get the redactors, okay, fancy word for editor. And then the redactors show up, 400 or 500 years later. So as you see in the handout in the chart, the Yahwist writer is committed to writing around 950 before Common Era. The Elohist comes in at around 850, so 100 years later, 850 before the Common Era. The priestly writers come on the scene now 250 to 350, depending on where you are looking at the writing, whether they're looking at the Yahwist or the Elohist. The priestly writers start coming in at around 700 to 600 BCE, and again capturing the history. And then you get the Deuteronomistic writers who are in around 600 to 500 before the Common Era. So documenting a resurgence, a renewal in the Jewish, Israelite, Hebrew history. And then, like I said, we've got the redactors who started weaving these stories together, with most of those redactions being done at around 450 before the Common Era. So you see as much of a span of 500 years. I mean, try to think, it's even hard for us to imagine something that was 500 years ago. That gap, that span of time between when the Yahwist was committing the oral history to writing in 950 BCE to the redactors some 500 years later, looking at, in 450 BCE, looking at these writings. So there's we have some familiarity, through books of what happened 500 years ago, but we don't really know it intimately. Okay, which is an important piece. What I think is actually really helpful in the handout is the color graph that's included on next to the last page. I'm looking at it in a different format. And you can see the colors, the color spectrum of the writers. So red being for the Yahwist, green for the Elohist, P for the priestly writer, and then the redactor, as it relates to each of these books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, looking at those books. And then Deuteronomy, of course, is the Deuteronomistic, writer, and that will have redaction as well. But we're looking especially at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so you can see who the primary authors were. But what's, I think, important to note about this, and you have to look at it kind of carefully, is that there are these narrow bands of the black for the redactor that show up across all of them. Okay, so there's redaction in all of this, editing in all of this. And sometimes it was to weave the story together in a way that maybe made more sense, or to try to, be even somewhat chronological perhaps with it. So I want to encourage you to not hold redaction in a critical way, meaning as in a pejorative sense, but to kind of recognize that the editors were attempting to, arrange things in a way that tell a story that made sense at the time, and certainly could have had, considerations for political interests. And, I don't want to minimize that. It certainly was an influence, but to not be, so negative necessarily toward the idea of, oh, they were redactors, oh, they were editors, and they changed things. And let's assume good intent. Okay, I guess is what I want to say. Let's assume good intent. So as we wrap up the readings of the book and the handout, the Bible is evolutionary as it was written and also as it is read and interpreted. So how it's read and interpreted has changed over time as well. And when I say changed over time, I'm talking even over as a result of the last 2,000 years, the way the Bible has been seen, and certainly in the modern era, the Age of Enlightenment changed considerably how the Bible was looked at, for example. But to recognize that the Bible is a process of making meaning. The writings are about a process of making meaning. It is something that has happened over time, and it is always how it's read and interpreted, and how it was written initially, how it was written and then redacted, was embedded in perspective. Okay, it is always going to be embedded in perspective. So it is an intersubjective document. It is not objective, like looking at a molecule, for example. It's not, and if we try to hold it that way, again, it falls flat, and it can lose its meaning. It can become dry and not helpful. But if we recognize it as an expression of, or an aspiration of, again, this relationship in God, then it can take on some very, very different ways of being in God and in our world. Okay, so this concludes this part of my comments around the reading and the handout for today. Okay, So moving to what we would normally be doing in the Collaborate session together, we're talking about, looking at the Bible through lenses. And so what type of a lens is the documentary hypothesis? And here's what I'm going to ask us to do is take some of these questions out of the Collaborate session and apply them to the discussion board. And I realize that this expands the discussion board considerably. So it's not like you have to go into like deep detail on each of them, but I would like you to address these in your discussion post, since we're not going to be able to have it together in Collaborate. What kind of a lens is the documentary hypothesis? And I touched on it in the lecture, but how do you see? What type of a lens is it? What kind of a lens is metaphysical Bible interpretation? Okay, so that is a way of being able to see and read the Bible. So how would you define what kind of a lens is a metaphysical lens? Now, this question, the third bullet in the Collaborate section of the syllabus, says, why is the primary limitation of the metaphorical approach of particular importance for unity practitioners? Okay, so important to going back to what are the limits of the metaphorical approach, and how would that apply to us as unity practitioners, and as we think about how we can perhaps go through with a metaphysical type of interpretation. So why is that limitation important for us? Now, the last piece, and then I'm going to just touch on the discussion board because we're in more of those kinds of questions, is, looking at the move from critical to post-critical naivety. Where do you place yourself on the spectrum as it relates to the Bible? Okay. And are you able to identify when this shift, if you have had that type of a shift, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Where do you see that having happened, for you? All right, so that's the discussion board. Now, let me come back to the group activity. And this is where things get really fun. It can get really fun. It's the group activity we would have broken into groups would be without the use of any metaphysical interpretation. What are some of the metaphorical meanings of the creation story? So in other words, the way the creation story in Genesis 1 is presented, there's a lot of imagery. It's telling us a story again about the creation of the world and humankind. So what are some of the metaphorical meanings there? What can we take away from? What is it telling us maybe about the nature of God, about the nature of humankind? What is the story trying to tell us about what it means to be in the Garden of Eden? Okay, for example, why is the garden? A garden's a metaphor, right? So why is a garden the setting, for example? So these are ways of metaphorical meaning. Metaphysical meaning would be, for example, looking, as Fillmore wrote about the 7 days of creation, about, illumination and faith and divine ideas. I mean, I'm jumping around. Things along those lines. We're not looking for any of that. We are not looking for the capacities of the powers as he saw them in the creation story. We are not looking for mind, idea, expression. That's another way that the creative process is conceived of, and Genesis representing, an aspect representing the creative process. So we're not looking for mind, idea, expression. These are all metaphysical types of interpretations. We are looking for why is the story written the way it's written? What is it trying to tell us by having been written and placed in the way that it's placed? And in that respect, and we do see a difference between Genesis 1 and 2, and we'll talk about that more when we get in depth into them next week. But what is it telling us perhaps about humankind, in terms of where it stands in the pecking order, for example? So that's the pieces related to what we would have done in Collaborate that will now move into the discussion board. And on the piece about the metaphorical meanings of the story, I would encourage you that if there are a couple of you that want to, find a way to connect with each other and have a conversation, to do that, because I would have put you in groups to work on it to begin with. So if you're able to do that together, would be really, really awesome. And if not, that's fine as well. And then wrapping the assignment for the mosaic is due on Sunday, April 26th. So your collage, your images, by the way, do not need to be hand done images. They can be images that you pull off the internet. They may be photographs that you already have in your photo collection. And this is your personal reflection, of the lenses that you have read the Bible, that you have used to read the Bible. And so the imagery, and then a few sentences as to why that image was important, what was significant about that image. So I'll give you an example that in a previous collage, somebody included an image of their aunt and uncle because they had been influential in their life in terms of teaching Bible stories to them. So that was one of the ways that they had read the Bible, that they were aware of the Bible, was through that family member, the aunt and uncle that were so important to them. In another collage, someone had used the picture of the dove and said that the Bible represented writings about peace. And so being able to see peace it was one of the lenses that was used. So there's, again, I think I mentioned one time somebody was like this, there was an image like, get thee away from me, and so a rejection or just a total, just aversion, total aversion to the Bible. So these are some examples of, what I'm looking for from you in terms of whatever has been meaningful to you in the lenses that you've seen or read, used to see or read the Bible up to and including, real time to, today. All right, friends, thank you for hanging in there. I look forward to seeing you next week, where we will start looking at the creation story more deeply. We've got a lot to cover in Genesis. Okay, so we're going to be looking at chapter 4 of Marcus Borg. We're going to be looking at chapters 1 through 4 of Genesis. Again, kind of high fly view. We will be incorporating in our awareness the handouts that go along with that module. So the composition of a three-tiered universe, a synopsis of the what's contained in the Torah, the Numbers, the wisdom writings, and the prophets. And then we'll continue to unfold in the documentary hypothesis, especially as we are looking at these different authors in the creation story. So again, I look forward to seeing you next week. I will see you on the discussion board, and thank you again for bearing with me in having to not be available for tonight's class. So many blessings and namaste.